Thank you for joining us on Living History. Before we get started on this week's episode, don't forget about Peter Hart's Gallipoli book that's coming out. I hope you've heard about this. We've been talking about it for a while now. Peter Hart has written a book called The Gallipoli Evacuation, all about the evacuation of Gallipoli, surprisingly, and he's written that for Living History. For us, we're going to be publishing this book, and it's coming out in September. It'll be printed in September, but as of next week, we are going to be pre-selling the book on our website, so you can pre-order that book and then have it in your hand as soon as it comes out in September. And if you pre-order the book on the website, you will also receive a very special behind-the-scenes interview with Peter Hart. I've recorded it already. It goes for about 2 hours, and Peter breaks down everything about the evacuation, his motivation for writing the book, and most importantly, those wonderful sources that he used to tell the story. And we've included in that behind-the-scenes interview audio files, actual veterans in their own words, talking about Gallipoli and the evacuation. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. So as of next week, go to the website, which is livinghistorytv.com, and pre-order the book, The Gallipoli Evacuation. In the meantime, here's this week's podcast.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and thank you for joining us on Living History. Last week marked the anniversary of the DDay invasion, the great campaign to retake Western Europe from the Nazis. And we all know the American story pretty well through films like Saving Private Ryan and the Band of Brothers miniseries. And last week we did a wonderful podcast about the British and Commonwealth contribution to the D-Day landings with Paul Reed. So if you haven't heard that one, go back and listen to that. But there's a part of the story that we don't know very much about at all, and I think as Australians this comes as a great surprise to us, but there was actually quite a significant Australian connection with D-Day. And so to hear all about that, to learn more about it, we're joined by Dr Lachlan Grant from the Australian War Memorial. Lachie, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Yeah, good afternoon, Matt.
Let's start, mate, with what were Australians actually doing on D-Day? I think most people wouldn't even realise there were Australians there, but there was a huge role played by the Australians on D-Day, wasn't there?
Well, yeah, the Australian story is not well known, but it's a very, very diverse story. One of the difficulties is that there's a few Royal Australian Air Force units involved, obviously, but a majority of the Australians are spread throughout the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy across the fleet, flying all different types of aircraft. In total, there's 3,300 Australians participate on 6th of June. About 500 of those in the Navy, and about 2,800 serving across over 200 Royal Air Force and RAAF squadrons.
That's actually a significant contribution. I mean, when you think about the numbers that landed on D-Day, it's only a small amount of the total. But I think this is something we forget, that at this stage of the war, we tend to think as Australians that our efforts were all focused on the war in the Pacific against the Japanese. But throughout the Second World War, we maintained a very strong contribution to the European theatre, didn't we?
Yeah, that's right. And we shouldn't just talk about the numbers on D-Day itself, because with a lot of military campaigns, the campaign goes on for 10 more weeks. And there's another 10,000 Australian airmen in reserve in Britain at this time. And casualties are quite high in the Air Force through this period. So more and more of those Australians in the reserve units are joining operational squadrons in the Battle of Normandy as it's waging over the weeks after 6th of June.
So what were these airmen and naval people mostly doing in the lead up to D-Day and then on D-Day itself?
Well, that's a really good point about the lead up to D-Day, because we know many of the Australians in Europe were serving in Bomber Command, and Bomber Command played a very important role in the interdiction campaign in the lead up to D-Day. And in fact, the interdiction campaign, one of the planners for that was an Australian Air Commodore, Kingston McLachlan, who was, and the interdiction campaign was bombing bridges, bombing railway yards, essentially isolating Normandy from the rest of France so the Germans wouldn't be able to get reinforcements into the area. And so Australian Bomber Command units in particular were heavily involved in those operations in the weeks leading up to D-Day itself.
Are we talking about here specific RAAF squadrons, or are we referring simply to Australian servicemen who were scattered amongst British crews?
Yeah, so this has got its origins in the Empire Air Training Scheme, and this was a scheme that saw 28,000 Australians trained as pilots or aircrew, and then they were sent off to join squadrons in Britain. And at the time of D-Day, there's about 16,000 Australian airmen based in Britain, but most of them are serving in Royal Air Force squadrons. So they're serving as individuals, seconded, if you like, to those Royal Air Force squadrons. But there's also the Article 15 RAAF squadrons in Europe at that time as well. But just to give you an indication of that diversity, and this is one of the difficult things pulling the story together, because it's not like telling the story of a division, an Australian division at Tobruk, or a battalion, the story of a battalion at El Alamein. They're serving as individuals scattered across the Royal Air Force and across ships in the Royal Navy. But to give you an indication of that diversity, on D-Day itself, the different types of aircraft that Australians were flying. They were flying Spitfires, Typhoons, Mustangs. They were flying Hellcats in the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm, flying Hurricanes, Tempests, flying Lancasters, Halifaxes, Mosquitoes, Baltimores, Sterlings, Dakotas, Sunderlands, Beaufighters, Mitchells and Albemarles. So that just gives you a sense of diversity there across all the different commands. Huge range of roles and bombing, supporting the ground units, and dropping paratroopers in the first actions on D-Day itself.
Well, tell us a little bit about what the experience was like for those airmen. What were they actually doing in those weeks and days leading up to D-Day, and then what were they doing on D-Day itself?
Well, I'll give you a story of one Australian pilot, Ron Minchin, and he spoke about, he was in number 38 group in 196 Squadron flying Sterlings, and the role of 196 was to tow gliders and drop paratroopers. And Ron Minchin, in the weeks leading up to D-Day, there was intense training, dropping the paratroopers, towing gliders and dropping gliders. And on D-Day itself, Minchin talks about the difficulty flying in the conditions. There was strong crosswinds. As we know, the weather was pretty rough on the day itself. It was chosen. There was strong crosswinds, so keeping on course was very difficult. It was very dark when he was flying, but also in the Sterling, they had to slow right down to drop the paratroopers at low altitude, and it's almost at stalling speed. So he talks about trying to keep the Sterling level without stalling, and knowing when they were approaching the drop zone, all the paratroopers in his Sterling were heading to the back of the Sterling where the hatch is for them to go out. So it's causing an unevenness in his aircraft. So just trying to keep level and straight and not stall. He's talked about having one hand on the throttle and the other hand on the stick, trying to keep in control. But then also the night sky lighting up when another Sterling was hit, and seeing paratroopers coming down and trying to avoid them as well as he's flying through the stream, as he's dropping the British 6th Airborne.
It's one of the unsung stories, really, of the invasion, is that the job played by those pilots. We talk a little bit about the glider pilots and the tough job they had to do, but the pilots of those transport planes that were dropping the paratroopers had a pretty awful time, and that quote really just sums up the difficulties they encountered, doesn't it?
Yeah, and quite a large proportion of the pilots in number 38 group were Australians, something like 15% or 41 of the pilots, and Minchin himself, the famous title of Cornelius Ryan's book, The Longest Day. Minchin himself flew 3 times on D-Day. He did the first parachute drop around midnight. He returned again to drop gliders and supplies in the afternoon, and then again on the evening of 6th of June. So 3 operations in one day.
And what about after D-Day itself? Because the Air Force played a huge role. The reason D-Day occurred in so many ways was because of the air superiority that we had over Normandy. What about in the days after D-Day? Were the Australians actively involved as the battle for Normandy really picked up steam?
Absolutely, and this is where the Australian casualties really start to build in supporting the ground forces and supporting the lodgement in those 10 weeks after D-Day itself. On D-Day, there's 13 Australians are killed in action, 2 sailors and 11 airmen. But these sort of numbers continue in the days after for the Air Force. On 7th of June, 20 Australian airmen are killed. On 8th of June, it's another 22. As the month goes on, the 13th of June, 28. And in fact, during this period of the battle and the build-up with that interdiction campaign, 1,100 Australians are killed in the air war in Europe. And that's quite a significant number if we compare it to some of the other campaigns Australians served in the Second World War. it shows you the contribution, particularly by the Royal Australian Air Force. And 1944, and this period of 1944 was the worst for the RAAF in terms of casualties. And it's very much supporting that lodgement in Normandy.
That's absolutely extraordinary, those numbers. And I suppose it makes sense that as the line advanced across Normandy and then across France towards Paris and then eventually across Western Europe, the sorties are becoming longer, they're having to fly further, they're more likely to encounter German aircraft as they push more into Western Europe. So I suppose it makes sense that the casualties are increasing as that battle just grinds on.
Yeah, and the Australian airmen fighting in the 2nd Tactical Air Force, so these are guys flying Spitfires and Typhoons, and this includes the Australian Spitfire Squadron, 453 Squadron, which was one of the first squadrons to have wheels on the ground in France after the landings. But their airfields are very close to the front line, so they come under enemy shell fire, but they're essentially taking off and almost immediately engaging ground contacts, and very dangerous flying at low level in the Spitfires and the Typhoons. And 453 Squadron, during the first few months of Normandy, they essentially turned over the entire squadron. And that's through losses of pilots killed in action, those wounded, those who finished their operation. But essentially, they've turned over the squadron over 100% during this period. It gives you a sense of the numbers. And there's a great account in the War Memorials collection by a Typhoon pilot named Herbert Copeman. And he joined his Typhoon squadron in Normandy a few weeks after the campaign started. And he said after only a couple of days, he thought he wasn't going to survive the war. He had this really fatalistic approach. Copeman did survive, but he said that on VE Day, when the wing was celebrating the Allied victory, he looked around and he felt really sad and lonely because he was the only Normandy veteran left from the squadrons that he joined several months before.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? I think it's something we often don't consider with Normandy, is that we think, even though D-Day was horrific, obviously especially for the men coming ashore on the beaches, we seem to think of D-Day as the beginning of the end, and we almost summarise the Second World War after D-Day as it sort of wrapped up pretty quickly from that point onwards. But some of the toughest fighting of the entire war took place between D-Day and the surrender in 1945, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we after the D-Day campaign, there's the Market Garden operations, capturing those bridges at Nijmegen, Eindhoven and Arnhem, and the Australian guys in the RAF, of course, again, are heavily involved in that. They're heavily involved in supporting, in particular, the American troops during the Battle of the Bulge, which was the costliest campaign for the Americans in the entire war, and they're flying right up through into the advance into Germany, right up to VE Day.
And what about, coming back to D-Day, Lachlan, what about the experience of the Navy? Because obviously this is an amphibious landing. The ships were a vital part of the story. What were the men of the Navy doing from an Australian perspective?
Well, there's some pretty incredible stories by some of our members of the Royal Australian Navy. There's no Royal Australian Navy ships involved in D-Day, but there's about 500 sailors who were sent over to the UK to serve on attachment in the Royal Navy. Many of these men had gone across as in what was called the Yachtsman Scheme, and so these were sailors that had small boating experience, like yachting experience, and these guys, of course, were ideally experienced for commanding small craft, such as landing craft. So a lot of them ended up in combined operations. One of them who was killed at Juno Beach on D-Day was Sub-Lieutenant Richard Peary. D-Day happens to be his 24th birthday. Peary had played for the Hawthorn Football Club in the then VFL in Melbourne before enlisting in the Royal Australian Naval Reserve, and on D-Day he was in command of a landing craft support which had a specific role of getting in really close to the shoreline, and it had a gunnery spotter on board who was trying to spot the German artillery positions to direct the gunfire from those British battleships and cruisers and destroyers offshore. And he was spotted by the enemy, and his ship was hit, and it was also said it simultaneously struck a mine, and he was killed in action. And he's one of two of the Australian sailors who were killed on the day.
It must have been a pretty horrific ordeal for those blokes coming in the landing craft, and being right at the coalface. It's not just the blokes getting out of the landing craft that are going to come under fire. The vessels themselves made pretty inviting targets for the Germans, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other Australian who lost his life was Sub-Lieutenant Bruce Ashton at Gold Beach, and he was in command of a landing craft assault equipped with a special hedgerow mortar, which was there to clear a path up the beach for the infantry. And his landing craft was hit by a landing craft that was out of control and capsized his craft, and he was killed in action as well. And he's buried in the Bayeux War Cemetery in Normandy. But there's some other amazing stories of Australians in the Navy on D-Day. Lieutenant Kenneth Hudspeth from Tasmania has an extraordinary story. He commanded one of the midget submarines, one of the two British midget submarines, which were essentially the vanguard to the fleet. They were the first two boats to go in to shore. And he actually spent several days offshore because of the delay in the weather. His submarine had to remain submerged, and during daylight hours over there at that time of day, they had to be submerged for about 17 hours before they could pop up for air at night time. But his craft was there to mark the approach lanes to the beach, and so in the hours before the British fleet arrived, they surfaced, set up beacons to help guide the landing craft into shore. And their account's amazing because they're in this very choppy waters and they can hear the bomber streams going overhead and pulverizing the German positions on shore. And they're keeping an eye out for that first glimpse of a landing craft to come through. And then they hear the naval gunfire going over the top of them. And, it must have sounded like a freight train going over. And then in the shadows and the gloom, they start seeing landing craft going past them on either side. And he and his crew were sort of standing on the deck with waves crashing over them, cheering them on. Would have been quite a scene.
Just extraordinary. I had no idea about that story. It's brilliant.
His extraordinary tale, that was actually his second trip to Normandy. He'd been there in January and in his X-craft submarine, where he landed beach commandos who helped map what ended up being Omaha Beach. And he actually received his second bar to a DSC he won on the attack on the Tirpitz the year before. So pretty incredible story of service by Kenneth Hudspeth. But D-Day was his second trip to the Normandy beaches.
Who knew that there were these great Australian tales being told, being written on D-Day? It's just absolutely extraordinary. What about men who actually landed with British forces? Because even though Australians weren't involved in the landings, there must have been Aussies who were, Australian-born men, born and raised men who were living in the UK and enlisted in the UK Armed Forces. Do we have any numbers? I know it's vague. I know it's difficult to track them, but do we have any sort of indications of how many Australians were serving in the army and actually landed as part of D-Day?
Yeah, it's really hard to gauge how many enlisted directly in the British forces during the war, how many Australians in the UK enlisted in the British forces. So there were some Australians. We do know that there was 13 Australians, members of the AIF, who were serving on attachment with the British forces who landed in Normandy. These guys were sent over there to learn about some combined operations and landings using the Tactical Air Force, and then they brought that experience back to the Pacific for the final campaigns of the war. One of them was Major Joe Gallup, who was quite a famous character. He appears in the famous painting at the very beginning of the Australian War Memorial Second World War Gallery, the painting of Bardia. And Gallup has an account where he's got his Australian arm flashes on his shoulder, and there's German prisoners filing past. And when the Germans saw his Australian flash, they asked where the other Australians were, and Gallup said, it was just him. And he said they started taking off their wristwatches to give to him. And he said, I didn't know whether to be flattered or insulted.
I love that.
The reputation of the Australian soldier from the desert had gone that far.
I love that story. That's absolutely brilliant.
We uncovered a story when we were researching the Memorials collection a couple of years ago about an amazing Australian woman who landed in Normandy with the British forces. Her name was Olive Sherrington, and she was a nurse in the British Army in the First World War and had married an Australian officer and moved out to Australia. And after her husband had passed away, she was holidaying in Britain when the war broke out and enlisted in the Mechanised Transport Corps. And she served in France in 1940, and she was one of the last British women to leave France after Dunkirk. But she was one of the first to return as well when she drove her truck off a landing craft Normandy on about D-Day +3. And she was mentioned in dispatches and have received a commendation from bravery from King George and Winston Churchill. And we have her uniform and artefacts in the collection at the memorial. She returned to Australia 7 years after her holiday began after the war.
What a wonderful story. I had no idea about that. That's absolutely incredible. This is what I love about speaking to all you talented people at the War Memorial, Lachlan, is that you've just uncovered these incredible Australian tales. And without the work that you guys are doing there, we wouldn't know anything about these stories.
Well, as I said, Sherrington has an incredible account of the campaign in France in 1940, and after D-Day, she's very close to the front lines in Holland during that Market Garden campaign, and she's arrives at Belsen not long after the liberation of the camp there, and some of the items in the memorial's Holocaust display came from Sherrington, who collected them at the Belsen camp after the war.
What about after the war, the men and women who'd served on D-Day? Did they receive special recognition from the Australian government for their contribution to D-Day? Did they form associations? What did they do in the decades after the war?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Matt, because the involvement in D-Day in many ways was largely forgotten for many years. And in the lead up to the 50th anniversary, when Australia was invited to participate in the commemorations in France by the French President and Prime Minister, the Australian response at an official level was, well, we weren't really involved. And of course, the veterans who were there knew we were involved and wrote to the Department of Veterans Affairs saying, yeah, we were there and that. And eventually a cohort of Australian veterans went over. But this is a part of the difficulty for the veterans who were spread out across all of those different squadrons. Across the Royal Air Force. They came home, and many of them were a part of what was the Odd Bods Association. Odd Bods being odd bodies in the RAAF was sort of the colloquialism of the time. But they didn't have that sort of single experience and single voice. So different members of the Odd Bods Association had very distinct and different experiences. And I've read an account of one Typhoon pilot who talked about how there was no other Typhoon pilots in the association in the city that he lived in, and so there was no one around who had the kind of experience in the war he had. And so every 5 years he would go back over to the UK to join in the festivities and with commemorations with his squadron mates back over in the UK. So he just didn't find anyone in Australia who understood his experience.
And Lockie, is the story, the Australian story of D-Day, is that told in any way through exhibitions at the Australian War Memorial?
Yes, last year we had a very special exhibition specifically on some of the Australian stories of D-Day, and that was one of the first major exhibitions we would have had at the memorial, recognising the Australian involvement in telling some of those individual stories. But we have a small display case in the Second World War Gallery telling just a handful of the stories, and as I said, including the uniform of Olive Sherrington, the driver in the Mechanised Transport Corps.
Well, it's really just wonderful stuff. As we said, a bit of an unknown chapter of a really important story. And if you're listening to this and if you have a connection with an Australian involvement in D-Day, then please certainly get in touch, because I'd love to hear your story. Lachlan, what are you working on now at the War Memorial? What are we going to see next from Lachlan Grant?
Well, I have been working on a book on the Australian experiences of D-Day, which is a slow work in progress at the minute. But my main job at the War Memorial is looking at the Australians in Bomber Command for the new Anzac Hall development. Well,
it's wonderful stuff, mate. I encourage everyone to get down to the War Memorial in Canberra, especially with the changes that are going on there. There's bigger and better things always coming to fruition at the War Memorial. But Lachlan, thank you so much for joining us to tell us this story. It's an important story, and it's just really wonderful to hear your account of it.
No, terrific, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistorytv.com for more great history content.